Okay, so I, as a kid, was always interested in science. I remember constantly playing outside in this creek by the house that I grew up. And my mother was a seventh grade biology teacher. And because of that, of course, I would never be interested in biology. It wasn't cool, it wasn't deep. It's what my mom did. I had no interest in it whatsoever. And so when I was a kid, I wanted to become Stephen Hawking. And I definitely thought that physics was the only science that was thoroughly rigorous and so on. And that was the plan. And basically, I pursued that plan until I got to some of the true classes for physics majors. And what I found was that when we would get these problem sets, weekly problem sets, there was just an intuitive understanding of the systems that the problems were asking questions about that I just did not have, period. So the other physics majors that were with me could just see various ways of simplifying a problem, or things canceling out at infinity, or things can be disregarded because X, Y, and Z. And I just never had that facility. It was just ingraspable to me. And so I switched majors from physics to mathematics, where everything is very explicit, and I didn't think intuition had any role. Just get from this to this in a proof, and that's all you do, and you're done. And so about my junior year, throughout the entire undergraduate time as an undergraduate, I kept taking philosophy courses, and I thought it was just a side hobby that would never amount to anything. And I got to my junior year, and I had enough courses to get a whole nother degree in philosophy. And then I had to make a decision between either going to grad school in philosophy or going to grad school in mathematics. And I remember that decision, I wouldn't really say it was a decision that was made, because I don't think what really happened was a decision with a conscious procedure for deciding what was the most utility to pursue. Rather, I just walked into the mathematics library at the University of Illinois one morning, and the way the library was set up, there's this big divider, and all these mathematics journals were between them. And then there was just a set of long legal tables, like 1, 2, 3, 4, so maybe 12 total tables. And at almost every one of the tables, there was one single mathematics graduate student. No one was talking to one another, and they all looked to be in various degrees of complete and utter desperation, like staring out the window, like one with his head down, all completely sleep deprived. And I just thought, I don't think I want this. And I also think I realized that the vistas that you can see in philosophy are just much more rich and broad than what I could do in mathematics. Spending 40 years of your productive life proving esoteric theorems about some particular ring just didn't have the kind of appeal that thinking deep thoughts and pursuing philosophy had. So then I applied to graduate programs. I got into the University of Texas, and basically I then discovered through my advisor that that biology was actually a respectable science, and I started pursuing it in a serious way, and it just opened up in a way in which I had never, out of completely non-cognitive biases, ever given it credit for. And basically that's what's driven me to be where I am today. I guess the other thing I'll add is that I knew I wanted to go into graduate school in either mathematics or philosophy because, and this was my sophomore year as an undergraduate, I was employed as like a classroom assistant, which was assisting in a remedial mathematics course in these math labs. And within the first 2 weeks of that class and that job, it it was just absolutely apparent that I wanted to be a teacher at the college level. I was 19, I believe, at the time, just before I turned 20, and it was just absolutely immediately apparent. And I sort of thank God in some respects that things were clear to me so early and that I didn't have to search to find the thing that I wanted to do with my life.
I remember once I was picked up by a kid for a conference. I was with some friends, and the kid came to us and said, "You're the philosophers." And we said, "How do you know?" "Well," he said, "of the people in the waiting room, there was a guy shuffling his feet. He wasn't a philosopher. And there was a woman with a big box. She wasn't a philosopher. That left you." Can you say a little bit about the work you do now?
So the work that I do now is divided into a handful of different areas. The two main areas are philosophy of biology, and in particular philosophy of ecology. And that's an area of the philosophy of biology that I think is underrepresented right now. It merits more attention from philosophers of science because there's a lot of riches in the science of ecology that just haven't yet been explored as much as they have in other subdisciplines of science, for example, evolutionary theory and even molecular biology. The other major component of my work is on the history of analytic philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of Rudolf Carnap, and to a lesser degree Quine. I think that the kind of picture of philosophy and the methodologies pursued by Carnap have a lot of contemporary resonance. And I think that there's a growing understanding among many in the philosophical community that Carnap's worldview is very different than the kind of caricature you often see in the criticisms of logical positivism. And that's definitely a route that I've been pursuing for a long time. Related areas are environmental philosophy. That's obviously closely related to philosophy of ecology. And I would also include formal epistemology. So using formal methods and formal tools to shed light, hopefully, on some of the traditional and even some of the not traditional but new to statistical methodologies, epistemological issues that are relevant to the sciences. So obviously all four of those areas in some ways complement one another.
I can see three of them. How does the Quine-Carnap stuff
Because
connect to anything else?
So he gives, I think that he gives, and Carnap more than Quine, I think he gives the more complete picture of how the other three areas should be understood in a much broader focus. So you could obviously do philosophy of ecology, you can obviously do environmental philosophy without considering any questions about metaphilosophy or what standards are appropriate in adjudicating philosophical questions or determining the content of some concept. But I think that's where Carnap gives the right kind of view.
Let's go back to that early prejudice you had against biology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious if, from riper consideration, the prejudice still stands in some way. That is, that there's something seriously different between what Hawking does and what biologists do, and that in some sense biology is softer.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that the two sciences are very different, but I don't think that any of the relevant differences between the sciences in any way mark an inferiority on the part of biology. So in a certain sense, the kind of things that are being studied by biologists are softer in the sense they're not as amenable to sort of precise quantification precise empirical interventions as they are often in physics. But that doesn't mark some epistemological or methodological deficiency on the part of biology. And it's now clear from the vantage point of who I am now that my former self didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
Well, one thing one sort of gets at a distance from these sciences is the idea that Hawking might, if he hits on the right idea, say something like the last word, or at least go very far towards a last word, a theory of everything, some kind of comprehensive view that leaves not a whole lot but mopping up activity for others. Now that may be a total illusion, but it's an illusion that Hawking has very carefully nurtured. With biology, you get a little bit of a sense, always another damned animal, always another damned ecosystem, everything depends on everything else, everything's environmental, properties emerge, and in general, you'll be studying beetles and bugs till the cows come home, and there will always be another beetle and another bug and another little ecosystem for somebody to goof around with. Now, is at that level of classic comics characterization, does that seem right?
So the prospects of a grand theory in physics, is there a similar prospect in biology? Not totally clear that I think there is a similar prospect. One could argue that yes, there is, at least in evolutionary theory, and we've basically arrived at the broad brushstrokes of that with Darwinian evolution through the various mechanisms. Could that extend to other aspects of biology, for example, to ecology? I'm not clear that I can answer that question. I suspect no, because I suspect that there's a greater degree of contingency in the ultimate things that explain the patterns that we see in the ecological world. I'm not completely wedded to that idea, but I can't rule it out, and I'm not clear how I would adjudicate that without just waiting for the end of science at the end of history. On the other hand, even if there were a grand unified theory that emerged, and hopefully one will next decade or next year, I'm not clear that it would be truly grand and unified in the sense that it would show all kinds of insights about the biological world. It would unify underlying fundamental physics, but I'm not clear at all how, without a hell of a lot of work, you'd be able to relate it in any sort of insightful way to the biological world, let alone the social or psychological world.
I have a little bit of trouble getting my head around the idea of philosophy of ecology, and indeed around ecology as a discipline just by itself. Can you say a bit about what's going on there?
So ecology as a discipline can be characterized in a variety of different ways. One of the canonical characterizations you'll often hear is it's the science of the patterns of distribution and abundance of organisms throughout the world. So ecology is supposed to study how biological communities, ecosystems more generally, are put together and their structure in a way that doesn't just simply derive from their evolutionary history that got them to the point that they're at. So one thing that should be noted about that then is that ecology is at least as ambitious in terms of scope as evolutionary theory. So you would expect that the philosophy of ecology would be at least as important as the philosophy of standard evolutionary theory. It's also the case that you can't really understand evolutionary dynamics without understanding ecological dynamics, because obviously what accounts for the fitness of an organism has something to do with its degree of adaptedness and its fit with the environment that it's in. So it looks like there's parity in terms of import for these two different fields of biology. So now turning to philosophy of ecology, there's just a wide variety of different topics that are just beginning to be pursued in any sort of depth in that field. So one of those topics is, is the biological world divided into units that we would recognize within ecology? Is it really the case that populations of different species compose into communities that mark off a relevant bound that should be recognized in any science that targets those kinds of systems? Another question is, what are the relationships between some of the concepts that you find in physics and some of the modeling strategies that you find in physics to it looks like the same kind of modeling strategies as they're pursued within ecology? So often sciences progress when they borrow tools and concepts and techniques from other sciences, but often when you borrow those tools, concepts, and techniques, there's implicit assumptions, implicit commitments in those things that aren't explicit, and if you don't vet whether they're appropriate for the science, like appropriate for ecology versus appropriate for some physical system, obviously ecological systems are physical systems, but you know what I mean, then you could really be misled in what's the correct way to represent and analyze a given ecological system. There's a lot of other topics, like how should a concept of biodiversity be characterized? It's not entirely clear how that very amorphous and seemingly unwieldy concept can be made scientifically tractable. Is there a defensible conception of a balance of nature that applies to ecosystems or biological communities? But I should stress that with respect to philosophy of ecology, these are very early days. This field within biology, irregardless of its import scientifically, is just starting to get the philosophical attention that it deserves.
Well, I mean, of course I'm limited by a kind of comic book picture of biology, but let me just sort of lay out my comic book picture of what I am. I'm gathering that I've got a lot of little things that are sort of like animals inside of me, and some of them carry DNA rather different than my own. And the story about how I came together as an organism, or the kind of thing I am came together as an organism, is that very, very long ago, a whole bunch of things started working together rather more tightly than they were working together with anything else, and gradually established a boundary, and then began doing that process again, and have now established a boundary which is kind of my skin. That's the story I hear. And then, when I go into the forest, and there's this frog that is in some kinds of relationships with squirrels and birds and things it eats and so forth, which might seem to be tighter than his relationship with something way up in the air. And again, you say, well, that's an ecosystem, and this is an organism. But I'm imagining it's really kind of a continuum. I mean, to some extent, especially if I have a tapeworm that hasn't killed me yet, I'm an ecosystem,
Right.
rather like the frog. And of course, things like me compete with other things, and we work out which one's going to live on. And we can imagine ecosystems similarly competing and winning or losing or showing characteristics that tend towards survival. How much of this talk going back and forth between organisms and ecosystems makes any sense?
Well, I mean, the details that you sketched about the organism have come to challenge some ideas about what constitutes a biological individual. So if it really is the case that me, the full physical suite, is composed of all of these different microflora, and my metabolism, my ability to survive and reproduce, depends essentially on those different organisms, then in what sense is there an individual thing here? What's the correct conception of a biological individual such that it comes out with the appropriate judgment on that question? So once you have some questions about the relevant standards there, then you can start applying those to things that, from a commonsensical perspective, are not a biological individual. But on the new standards, it looks like, oh, they may be an individual as well. So, those sorts of questions, and whether it really is a continuum between those, are the kinds of questions that are relevant, both to philosophy of evolutionary theory, but also philosophy of ecology. I mean, obviously, sometimes when you see an ecosystem, there are precise, causal boundaries that you can identify. So if I'm looking at, a small lake, then the relevant community there, with some fuzz on the edges, is very clear because it's delimited by the aquatic environment. But it's not at all clear once you start going, say, into a boreal forest, right, where you should mark off that boundary. Now, then second, what are the right standards for adjudicating whether this entity is a real whole that sort of marks the real in the way in which we say I, as an individual organism, are real. So one of the criteria that has also been invoked there is, there's a clear causal boundary. Another one is that there's a mechanism for maintaining that boundary, and it's not clear that on all those different kinds of criteria that an ecosystem is going to be the same, possibly even in degree, to an individual organism like myself.
Does anything much ride on this sort of determination? I mean, what's an individual? I mean, what about the person who just says, well, for the problem that we are considering, or the study that we're doing, or the grant that we're applying for, we will consider the linkages among these 47 things, and maybe we'll consider the linkages between Shay's mitochondria and the larger cell, or maybe we'll consider the linkages between, wasps and the various things which they so hideously are parasitic upon.
Hideously.
The wasp stories are horror stories that make anything go to sleep. But you say, well, we'll just chop up the world as we want. We'll take our individuals as we need to for whatever job we're doing, and not get into Thomistic, scholastic nitpicking about what's an individual and what's a system and so forth. Where does the rubber meet the road there? I mean, where does it start mattering?
What does matter? That's a good question. So, Is anything that I've said in any way in conflict with a kind of disposition where you just impose on the world the boundaries for what you're interested in studying? No, nothing prevents somebody from having that kind of disposition. Is that all then that matters? So the fact that you could pursue study of these systems in that way, does that show that no other question matters? I'm not entirely clear on that second question. If you're somebody who is concerned with metaphysical questions about what is real, quote unquote, if you're concerned about ontology, then it seems like you will be concerned with these kinds of questions. Whether you should be concerned with those questions of ontology and what metaphysically is real is one of the very deep questions in philosophy, and that's the kind of question that a Carnapian view and Quine has a lot to say about.
Well, I was introduced to the project of doing these interviews by a description of a Templeton project, which I take it numbers of folks are working on, which is about trying to sort of fuss with this question, well, is science getting any closer to what's real? And I'm wondering, at this point, I know it's early in the grant stage thing, and all kinds of revelations might come out, but how you think about that? Does that seem to be an important question, or is it just sort of the kind of thing that people who don't know a lot of science keep asking?
Well, look, one person's deep truth is another person's trivia.
Yeah.
So one's answer to that question is going to depend upon the perspective that they're coming at it from. So I can say that within the philosophy of general philosophy of science, the question of scientific realism versus anti-realism is a live debate. And if you're a scientific realist, then you think that our best theories, our mature theories, are giving us some grasp, proximate truth, or maybe glimpses of the real truth. And if you're an anti-realist, you think that that kind of epistemological claim is indefensible, that the standards being used to make that inference are not defensible. I'd rather not comment which side of that camp that I'm on right now.
Well, my Facebook is a kind of human zoo with the broad. Having been a philosopher, you understand the kind of rigorous people you get, and then I also get people who have a very expansive view of sort of what sorts of things count as unities. I want to talk about
unities.
We want to talk about want to say things like, well, we're all part of some grand unity. Mm-hmm. It's probably a mistake, and a moral mistake in some ways.
Moral mistake?
Yeah, to take us to be separate, although we naturally do, but we need to get away from that. So that for some of the people I run into on my Facebook page, these are issues. It matters. My individuality, the sense of a too limited sense of individuality is the source of all the problems we have. And they will go out. They'll reach out to ecology for help.
With respect to the ethical claim, I have a lot of sympathy with that kind of disposition. But I wouldn't take it to be the case that that ethical disposition requires founding in or must derive from some scientific fact about how everything is interconnected or something like that. And on that second issue, I think that it's pretty clear it's false. There are not these interconnections between everything, as is sometimes claimed. And you can point to many different examples. And the case that I use in my environmental ethics course is the devil's hole pupfish. So these little bitty fish that are in these little bitty glorified puddles in Death Valley, their entire ecosystem is delimited to this glorified puddle. What real connection is there between, this little fish in this puddle and the rest of the world a mile away from that puddle? What possible causal connections could there be? Looks like there aren't any. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have this more universalistic ethical disposition.
So the fact-value distinction is, in a certain sense, for you, alive and well.
That is very true.
I see. Well, I'm really intrigued by your suggestion that Carnap might be the appropriate person for helping us to think about ecology. I'm wondering if you might say just a little bit about, at the level of people who are hearing the word Carnap for the first time, about what someone who's a philosopher of science, a logician, brings to these issues.
Yeah, Carnap doesn't really bring much directly to philosophy of ecology. He never really was that concerned with biology in general. But I do think that the kind of philosophical worldview that Carnap outlines has a lot of very compelling features and is quite deep, much deeper than the sort of caricatures you'll often find of Carnap and the other logical empiricists. And look, this is a giant topic that is very very nuanced and difficult to give in a soundbite, but basically one of the ways that I understand, and I think that's quite compelling about the way that Carnap approaches philosophical issues, is to ask questions about, what are the standards for adjudicating these kinds of questions? So if that question doesn't have a clear answer, well, then I become very suspicious about whether the kind of question being asked is a well-formed one or one where we really have a grasp for what we're trying to ask. So there's much more to be said there, but the idea that you have to be clear about how you would answer and what the appropriate standards are is one that I find has been fruitful for me in a wide variety of different contexts. Some contexts that are far removed from what people would typically think about when they think about Rudolf Carnap.
So, is specifically in philosophy of biology, is this a standard you apply? I mean, is this a test you apply? The question to which questions are in some sense meaningful?
In some sense, a very crucial qualifier. Yeah, in some sense meaningful. That's correct. Just to give you one specific example. So one of the philosophical methodologies that Carnap defends is what he calls explication. And explication is a means of conceptual engineering. So I've got some concept. It's not particularly precise. It's a bit vague. But it seems like this concept is not just a nonsensical concept. It's actually doing some kind of work. Well, what are the standards that I should use to formulate or redefine or contrast or transform this concept into something that does more work for me? And Carnap gives a 4 criteria procedure for adjudicating different attempts to precify, transform, revise a concept. And that methodology is in the service of a certain kind of epistemology. And I've used that approach to characterizing concepts in several different domains, but one domain is in trying to give a characterization of the concept of ecological diversity. And what I showed was, using an explicative procedure, the best way, or one of the best ways to characterize this concept is, and then I laid out this case for how to characterize precisely this concept. So the methodology of explication has wide applicability, and I should point out, many people think that Carnapian explication is supposed to apply only to scientific or empirical concepts, but no, not really, truly philosophical concepts. But that seems to me false. Carnap put no restriction on the scope of explication. And there's ways of doing explication for concepts that are not empirical, that are, say, logical or normative and not especially empirically based, that I think have a high degree of attraction in terms of what they deliver.
I guess I'm curious about specifically diversity. How does one make that precise in biology?
So ecological diversity, I should note, is a subset of biodiversity. And it's a very proper subset, and it being proper is what makes it more manageable than full-blooded biodiversity. So when you think of ecological diversity, typically you're thinking about two different kinds of considerations. One, and this is applied to a biological community, how many species are there in the community, so species richness, and then how are individuals in that community distributed among the individuals, distributed among the species in that community. And the two different, so as the species richness increases, the ecological diversity increases. And as the distribution between individuals is more equinomerous across species types, the higher the degree of ecological diversity. So ecological diversity, in this specific sense, is ignoring, considerations of phylogenetic diversity, further in the tree, phylogenetic diversity, morphological diversity, all kinds of other diversities that you would want to fold into a full biodiversity concept. But on this more restricted, but still nevertheless very general diversity concept, right, it seems like you can get some traction on how the concept should be characterized, and I suggest you get it from using something like Carnapian explication.
So, there's a lot of, one way when one goes with the notion of diversity is in the sort of political, social, ethical conversation where you talk about promoting that and worrying about when we lose that. Is there also a sort of scientific, is there a sort of scientific payoff for focusing on this phenomenon of diversity and this measure?
Scientific payoff, probably yes. So biological communities that are more diverse are almost certainly going to have many other properties that are relevant to giving an adequate representation of those biological communities than communities that are not especially diverse. So, for example, if you have a biological community that let's say has very few species, or maybe there's one absolutely dominant species and then a bunch of other species that have very poor representation in this biological community, then you can make a case. I'm not going to say it's a completely definitive case, but there is a case to be made that the one that has a more equinomerous distribution among species will be more stable in some respects. and the more stable a biological community, then the more likely it will persist through time. So you can see an argument being made that promoting diversity in this sense, ensuring diversity in this sense, could factor in some kind of argument for what you should do in terms of conserving biodiversity. Because ensuring a certain degree of ecological diversity would ensure a certain degree of stability. Stability is going to assist ensuring that this biological community persists through time, and that's what we want when we're engaged in conservation action. Now, I'm not saying each of the links in that argument is a definitive one, but you could see how that kind of argument could be made, and that would be one where ecological diversity is playing a very important role.
So, an ecological system that we might call boring. I mean, to go way back from these technical matters, but you know, it's got big frogs and little frogs, and there are a lot more big frogs than little frogs. Is also one that's not going to stay around, by and large, with big frogs and little frogs into a long future.
People have made that kind of qualitative claim, and give you a real world example, just look at the monocultures right now of citrus in Florida. You know, right now greening disease is killing the crops in Florida. Now, would the introduction of that pest as dramatically causally impact different biological communities that were composed of many more species than basically these monocultures? You know, it's not clear, but there's a plausible suggestion that it wouldn't have as dramatic an impact.
How do you handle the difficulties around, you know, what it means for a biological system to survive? I mean, if you've got a lot of species and you've got a certain distribution of species in an area, well, let's suppose you lose one. Is the thing still there?
Yeah, that's good.
If the proportions change remarkably, is the thing still there? How do you handle, in terms of that question about what's more robust, how do you handle the question, what does it mean for, say, a diverse system to endure?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what are the properties and relations that provide the identity conditions for these systems? Great question. You know, with respect to our earlier discussion, one of the possible answers is, you know, there are no identifying conditions like that. It's just whatever an individual is interested in looking at. So if I'm interested, when I'm viewing this system, if I'm interested in these particular species and one of them ceases to exist, then it's no longer the same system. Now from that position, you can get more sort of ontologically robust, where you're saying, no, it's actually, there's some kind of structural pattern here, and this species not being part of that pattern, or a different species playing that same role, that's still consistent with it still being the same system.
And if a whole bunch of our political and ethical decisions in some way depend upon this idea of preserving diverse systems, then how we settle that one becomes a pretty big deal.
Well, I mean, the whole question of what appropriately grounds an environmental ethic is a very fraught philosophical question. If you just think in terms of realpolitik on this question, what's really motivating a lot of people to care is like, oh, let's cute mammal with big eyes that blinks at me. You know, but presumably we don't think that that's a defensible ethical position about the environment. So then the question is, what are the things that can be appealed to broaden that conception to include things that you just don't have this immediate aesthetic appreciation of? And on that question, it's very hard to find good, convincing arguments.
And people who want to say it's not just a matter of taste, or it's just not just a matter of whim, are going to begin knocking on scientists' door for some notion more precise of what it is for this ecosystem to persist. I mean, if somebody says, well, I just don't care about spotted owls. They aren't interesting to me.
Yeah.
Oregon will be just as good without spotted owls. There's a lot of money to be made by getting rid of them.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone says that, the natural thought is, well, is there anything to say back?
Yeah, that's right.
That isn't just, well, I really like spotted owls.
Right. I mean, that is a difficult question. The science might potentially give us some help in some regards. You should care about these other species because these other species figure into the system in which the species that you really care about is an integral part. And if these other species go extinct, then the species that you care about will probably go extinct. So you should care to that degree. But that just seems to evade the deeper question, which is, what can you really say to some individual that says exactly what you just said? And here, I mean, it's a very difficult issue. I mean, one thing you should definitely keep in mind is, like, if somebody just is not ethically interested in anything, then you don't really have anything to say to them, period. Just because they're not concerned with ethics, that's not something they care about. That's fine. So we're talking about somebody who thinks that, the ethics is such that, they have a worked out system, they have reasons for their ethical views, and it just doesn't include caring about the spotted owl. Now, on that question, it's very difficult to find a good answer. One of the traditional answers that's given is, well, the spotted owl has intrinsic value. Now, if that's cashed out in terms of sentience, then I think that is a compelling ethical reason. An owl can feel pain, so an owl has ethical import in that sense, and that's a reason for ensuring the persistence, conserving that spotted owl. But what about organisms that can't feel pleasure and pain? What similar property of them can you appeal to that gives the same kind of ethical value? And on that question, I'm not clear what the real answer is that appeals to a property of that species or of that organism. Now, presumably, you could tell a story where you're appealing to the interests of the person who is in some way experiencing the species. You can tell some story about how they should have a broader ethical vision for the world. But at a certain point, that kind of story is going to fall on deaf ears if you can't appeal to something like the same sort of argumentative weight as sentience.
Well, the other day, just because I don't have the money to go to Costa Rica, I was taking a little tour through a bunch of photos of Costa Rica and the rainforest. And boy, a lot of animals, a lot of different animals, seeming to they've been there a long time, and they seem to be thriving. And I mean, one doesn't know how to cash it out exactly, but you look at that and you think, yeah, I want there to be that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll put some money into preserving more acres of that.
Yeah, I feel that.
And you can also look at some place where, some single thing, especially if it's sort of disgusting, but even if it's kind of ordinary, some animal has pretty much taken over everything. And, you look at the cane toad, in Australia, and you say, I don't want that in my country.
Yeah.
That guy who brought the cane toad, it should have been shot.
Well, jeez.
And I mean, and those are things you know. I mean, those are the starting points for people writing checks.
Yeah.
And for them voting, and for them, becoming activists.
That's right.
What they like, what they don't like. The notion of a thriving system. And if that can be given some clear meaning, I mean, it seems clear we're going to have to sacrifice some animals. I mean, there are animals that will not survive what's going to happen.
We may be one of them.
Yeah, but big predators are not doing well, and they don't, and things that depend on ice flows are not doing well. But then at the margins, we have some choices. We can say, we can make it a whole lot more likely that this animal will survive, but we may have to trade off some others.
That's right.
We have limited resources. Is there any scientific way, philosophy of scientific way of making out the case for one animal being more important than the other within the standpoint of a flourishing, thriving, vibrant ecosystem like that thing I was looking at in Costa Rica?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. When you view those pictures and feel a pull, right, what's uncontroversial is that you are feeling you are acquiring a lot of value from seeing those images, and indirectly then from those things existing such that images can be taken of them. That's clear, and that could be the basis for actually getting the resources to take a particular action. But can you make a stronger case? That's your question. Can I cash out this notion of thriving such that I get some further ethical argument beyond the kind of instrumental considerations such as, and by the way, when I say instrumental, I don't mean, I'm using this thing as a tool or in this narrow sort of economic sense. It's just basically value that is derived from a valuer getting value from something. Okay. So can I give some stronger ethical argument? I'm not clear you can. I don't want that to be the case. I would like that strong argument because I would like the strongest possible case for conserving those things. But beyond the things that we've already considered, so beyond considerations that, look, this system needs to be preserved in whole, mostly, because if you start taking things out, then the whole system is going to collapse and everything's put in jeopardy. Well, that's a sort of that's a conditional argument. It's dependent upon certain things being cared about in the first place. That was the first consideration. And the second consideration is, except for these priorities of things that can feel sentience over non-sentient organisms, and then, things that are conscious over things that are just sentient, and things that are self-conscious over things that are just conscious and just sentient. I think there is a kind of ethical hierarchy there. But that's still not going to give an additional positive argument in the case you just gave if the things you're looking at don't have those properties, are not sentient, are not conscious, and so on. I'm not clear what property beyond those kinds of considerations you can give to give a defensible ethical rationale for conserving them. I would like there to be such a case, but I just can't see it.
Now, if I were to go to any philosophy department meeting and then go for a beer afterwards and ask people to explain what's going on, they would tell me that there were certain people in the meeting who were contributing to the thriving of the department, a great deal more than others. Indeed, they would tell me that there were some people without whom the department would thrive a great deal better. And that for a church, a corporation, a government agency, and so forth. I mean, we have these intuitions that all animals are not created equal. In those relational communities we engage in most passionately.
Right.
Are there comparable things to say ecologically, that the thriving of this system of animals, I mean, where one will certainly leave at some point and others will come in and all sorts of stuff will happen. The thriving of this system is better supported by animal X than animal Y.
Yes.
Is that something that can be said
I think so.
sensibly?
I think not generally without system-specific details, but it does seem like in some specific cases that the answer is clearly yes. So just look at the impact of the collapse in honeybee colonies, for example. So it's pretty clear that that system, or I mean that species, makes a giant impact on the biological communities that species is a part of. In contrast with some other species which just don't play that same functional and causal role. So, and that's especially the case when you have very highly diverse biological communities where some species are quite rare. Just by sheer numbers, it's probably going to be the case that very rare species just don't contribute as much to the overall functioning of an ecosystem as others. Now, you can't say that in general. It really depends upon what kind of biological community or ecosystem that you're looking at. But sometimes I think you can say that. And if then you care about that system and you care about the species that compose that system, then that can give you a stronger rationale for saying that these individual species should be conserved.
And for making certain trade-offs.
Correct.
If you only have enough resources to
Correct.
preserve.
And we only
one
always
sort.
have finite amount of resources.
Right. So you might say, well, there are all sorts of scenarios I could lay out that would count aesthetically as this being spoiled. And on these 500 scenarios, this little critter is making the difference.
Right.
It's not a matter of everything dying,
Right.
but this becoming a great deal less interesting. Of course, you've got interest leading,
That's correct.
and you probably can't get that out of there.
I would love for you to be able to get it out and give something stronger, but I also know that by the arguments that I've considered, I can't say that there's a good case that's been yet made.
I see. So you're not necessarily, if I'm getting it right, you're not necessarily real hopeful that ecologists and philosophers of ecology are going to be, as it were, helpful and reliable partners of environmental activists.
To the degree to which they can supply something, I would imagine that they would. So if anybody is going to give you scientific resources to make your ethical case, it will be the ecologists, the environmental scientists, and then the philosophers of ecology and environmental sciences. But it's not clear that strong ethical conclusions are going to follow from the science that those individuals can contribute.
So it may turn out that it's just going to be two different discourses about the same plots of land.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're an ecologist, traditional ecologist, working in some hectare, trying to intimately know how things are structured in this tropical rainforest community, then it's not clear that the kind of work that you're doing every day, measuring these things, taking their dry weights, so on and so forth, is going to in some way give you strong ethical grounds for conserving that thing. Now, it may give you some resources by showing that certain things are connected in ways that if you care about one, then you must care about another, or in illuminating details that are inputs into the ethical disposition that somebody already has. Like, oh, I really, this thing is really intricate and complex, and I really love those sorts of things. And look, I'm reading the scientist's work, and I see all these intricate details. That really makes me care about that thing. That's great. But I'm not clear from the scientific facts alone that you could get some ethical value.
Or concepts that would allow you to make ethically important decisions.
I think yes, but I'd have to think about that one more.
Well, I have a certain urgency about getting rid of certain wasps. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.